Welcome everybody to the Grassland 2.0 four-part digital dialogue series that we're just beginning. This is the first of the four-part digital dialogue series for the fall. And our theme for this digital series is, what are healthy agroecosystems? And so that will require us to explore maybe what do we mean by agroecosystems? What do we mean by healthy? And where are we now with respect to healthy agroecosystems, and where are we headed? And of course, the Grassland 2.0 project is all about trying to find ways to map out and plan transformative change in agriculture towards a system that more closely resembles the functionality of the original prairie. That's the idea with Grassland 2.0. Not to say that we would restore native prairie all across the landscape necessarily, although I know Laura and I would love that. We still have to find ways to feed ourselves and that sort of thing. And so it really is about the functionality of the agriculture that we practice. And that's a part of our pursuit and our search. So we have a wonderful lineup this fall, and glad you could join us today. I'm going to turn it over to Laura Payne now, who's going to introduce our guest today.
Thank you, Randy. So I'm Laura Payne. I'm the outreach coordinator for the Grassland 2.0 project, and I've had the honor of knowing our speaker for over 10 years now. Dan and I worked together at the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture. Dan has always amazed me with his the breadth and the depth of his thinking and knowledge. Having spent 30 years as a dairy farmer in northwestern Illinois before he came to Wisconsin. He worked a lot with the DATCAP Farm Center with farmers dealing with financial struggles and issues, and spent some time as administrator of the Division of Agricultural Development at the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection. He's also spent some time with Midwest BioAg and is currently the president and CEO of Cooperative Network. His new talent, which I wasn't aware of, is maybe it's not new. Dan just published a volume of poetry, and he'll be weaving in some of his thoughts and perspectives on dairy farming and that poetry collection in his presentation today. So I'll turn it over to Dan to share his presentation titled Broken Ground, the Changing Culture of America's Dairyland. Go ahead, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, everyone, for having me. It's always a pleasure to work with groups that are so dedicated to finding a better way forward for Wisconsin agriculture and Wisconsin farmers. So it's my privilege to be here today. And I'd like to say that, where I'm speaking from today is really from a lifetime experience in agriculture. And as Laura pointed out in her introduction, from several different viewpoints. And each one of those viewpoints really helped shape my understanding and perception of what agriculture is, its impact on our environment and our people, and what it could be. So really, the basis of my thoughts, of course, were grounded growing up on a dairy farm, going home and running that farm for 30 years. Probably the most pivotal moment of my 30 years as a farmer was 20 years in transitioning a confinement-based large dairy to rotational grazing. A great challenge. We could probably do a whole series of webinars on just that transition process, but it really put me back in touch with why I wanted to become a farmer in the first place. And it really showed me a lot about the benefits of the work that Randy and his colleagues do in grass-based agriculture and those types of things. And then when I moved on to DATCAP after leaving farming and became a farm financial consultant, it really gave me the opportunity to work with farmers all across the state, sit at their kitchen table, delve into their financials, but also to hear their life stories, to see what are the challenges and opportunities that all of our farmers are working through constantly in this very important and essential industry. When I moved on to be the administrative agricultural development, it really showed me the size the depth of Wisconsin agriculture. We used to say everything from cranberries to zucchinis, you know, all the things that we produce, domestic markets, international markets, different programs working with local and regional food, financial assistance, mental health assistance, all those programs that Department of Agriculture runs to really help support Wisconsin's farmers. When I spent 3 years as president and CEO of Midwestern BioAg, for the first time in my farming career, I was on the other side of the table, the side of the table that can set their price, that has a whole team, a whole industry of people working towards one goal. And that was very revealing to see agriculture from the supply side, from the retailer side, not from the producer and the purchaser of those input side, and to see how really unbalanced those two things are, which I think have caused a lot of issues over the years for a lot of our farmers. And today, as president and CEO of Cooperative Network, association that supports 200 cooperatives in Wisconsin and Minnesota from a dozen different business sectors. So everything from housing to food co-ops to credit unions, agricultural cooperatives, farm supply, all these cooperatives that are so grounded in agriculture and in our rural communities, you know, just that network of people that make up rural Wisconsin and our rural economy. Those are the vantage points that I'm speaking of today, and the vantage points that I use to write Ancestral, a collection, as Laura said, that really spans 40 years, spans my entire career in agriculture, that really tries to look at some of these trends and challenges and concerns that we'll be talking about today. And it's a good thing to talk about because in Wisconsin, agriculture is always in the news. You can pick up the paper any day of the week, and you can see headlines such as this about our growing milk surplus, our low prices, rising cost, or scrutiny over how large some of our farms are getting and what's the potential impact of that. But what's really interesting about these headlines is that I took those from the Monroe Evening Times newspaper, actual headlines published in 1978. That was 43 years ago. We're still having the same discussions today. Each one of those headlines could appear on the paper of the Wisconsin State Journal tomorrow. So the same issues really are facing us today. So when Ancestral was published and it got out into the general public and got some press behind it, I got a request from the largest newspaper in Australia, the Times newspaper, who had become aware of Ancestral and my writing about the Wisconsin dairy industry. And they said, in 400 words or less, can you write us an op-ed piece that explains to Australians what's going on in Wisconsin? And I did. I took a shot at it, and I thought maybe that would be a good way to start our conversation today, is just to read you this brief essay that I tried to sum up this very complex time in Wisconsin agriculture. And it goes like this. Nearly every day, somewhere in America's Dairyland, another dairy farmer calls it quits. The milk pump goes silent, the cows are loaded onto trucks and trailers, the barn lights are turned out. This exodus from the dairy industry has been going on for decades. In 1978, the year I started dairying on my family's farm, Wisconsin had 47,700 licensed dairy farms. Today, there are about 6,775 still standing. Yet Wisconsin's cow population and milk production continues to set records. There is no shortage of affordable dairy products in the grocery store. It appears Wisconsin has done a great job of keeping the cows, but not so much the farmer. As a result, the rural communities of Wisconsin face challenges shared across Wisconsin's farm belt. Fewer farm families have resulted in shuttered schools and stores, depreciated infrastructure, and absentee agriculture. Commodity agriculture dominates the dairy and grain sectors as we bet the farm that someone, somewhere in the world, will buy all the American farmer can produce. There is little talk of production controls, diversified agricultural systems, or the social, economic, environmental, and cultural impacts of what farming has wrought. Decades ago, the American farmer was told to get big or get out, and that remains the rule. I grew up on and later operated for 30 years a Midwestern family dairy typical of the time and region. My family provided the management, labor, resources, and sweat equity the farm required. The farm was both home and business. The family tended the cows and land from sunup to sundown. In turn, we were fed, educated, housed, and in all ways made whole. Then in 2007, after generations of dairying, I sold my cows. The treadmill of modern agriculture had worn me out. The barn where I had learned dairying from my father, where I had spent countless hours as a child and later as a dairyman, went dark and silent. Sadly, my experience is not unique. I share it with all the dairy farmers who have exited the industry over the years. Academic papers and public policy forums have tried to decipher America's changing farm landscape. I chose a different approach. I wrote a book of poems, Ancestral, about the farm, farming, aging, and the changes one endures in a life dedicated to such an essential profession. There is a reason the word culture lies within the word agriculture. So over that time that my op-ed piece tried to summarize in very brief form, our common solution has always been expand production, pursue economies of scale, utilize credit to invest back into the farm and to grow the farm, and to maximize efficiencies. We have constantly told farmers how important it is to maximize efficiencies. And along that time, the farmer has, kind of tried to keep up with the rising cost of living, rising operation and investment cost in farming. All these challenges of staying in touch and ahead of a constantly changing agriculture, which is part of a constantly changing world. After all, farmers do not live on an island. Many of the farmers I worked with as a crisis and financial counselor at the Farm Center were in trouble because they failed to do these things. They failed to expand, to grow their operation to the point where it could support the family and return what they needed for their lifestyle. And over this course of time, we've really dealt with this low margins, high risk. I recently asked an agricultural banker why he thought that there wasn't more outside investment in agriculture from like the private equity world or those types of things. And he said, because it's the margins are too low and the risk is too high. And I thought that really summarized a lot of what the challenge in agriculture is. We work with very small margins and we work with a very high risk. And that risk comes in the forms of a constantly changing market, constantly changing weather, and now the impacts of climate change, where we see these rain events in Wisconsin occurring on an annual basis that we used to think occurred once a century, 11, 12-inch rainfalls in a single watershed, dealing with all of that impact. And then, of course, as we've had to grow agriculture to maintain its presence in the overall economy and society, just the competition for land and resources, the need to constantly change and adapt, all the time that the family is changing, aging, mental and physical health is deteriorating as we try to keep up with what I mentioned in my op-ed piece as the treadmill of modern agriculture. And it's amazing that through all of this, we have so many farm families that will work so hard to stay in the game, to stay there, and how many generations removed from the farm people who haven't grown up on a farm or worked on a farm or anything still feel that pull back to ancestral land. They can remember being with their parents or their grandparents or their great-grandparents on a farm, and it really holds that cultural lock to us. And that is something that I really wanted to explore in my book. But over the time of this constant change in agriculture, it's kind of ironic that an industry that values so much on heritage and tradition and the family unit and the family tie to ancestral land, while it's doing that, has to deal with so much change because agriculture is constantly changing. And what's driving that change? Well, obviously, the advancements in technology, genetics, and nutrition. We can do things today in agriculture that when I started farming in 1978 would have been a pipe dream. Just the management, the technology and precision agriculture and the equipment, you could go on, but you get the idea. It's changed drastically in the course of one person's career. If you just take myself from when I started to where I am today, how much farming has changed in an industry that values heritage so much. We have those new methods of farm production and management. Over the last several decades, we've had really good interest rates for farming. We've had available credit to grow and expand and purchase land and bring another generation onto the farm and all those types of things that constantly drive change. And obviously, as a result of that, we've had specialization and consolidation, some vertical integration in some parts of agriculture. There are career and lifestyle alternatives out there that pull people out of agriculture into other worlds, which allows all these other things that we've talked about to take up the slack and continue to provide consumers with reasonably priced food. And then, of course, we've seen new markets emerge. Could be the organic market in the United States. It could be new food and products in the domestic market, but it also really entered into the international marketplace in the course of my agricultural career that really changed agriculture a great deal. So with all that change, what have we really gained? And I will have to admit, we probably gained a lot. We have the world's most plentiful food supply. We spend the lowest percentage of our income on food. That food supply is consistent, safe, and reliable, really the envy of the world. How safe it is to walk into any grocery store or restaurant, and agencies like DATCAP deserve a lot of credit for this, to establish the permitting and the regulations that make sure that we do have that safe, reliable food supply. Are freed up much of our society to pursue other interests. We don't have a lot of people out hunting and gathering and trying to find their next meal. There are other opportunities because we have such a small percentage left at the farm that feeds everyone else. And then, of course, we've really taken on a major role in feeding the world. But just like with everything in life, when you gain something, you lose something. And we have to be honest, if we're going to have an honest conversation about this, what have we lost? Well, you can drive across the rural Midwest and you can see it from the car window. We lost a significant part of our vibrant rural population in small towns. We've lost that engagement of our rural communities of Main Street businesses and strong local school districts and all those things that really make a community. We've lost the support system of many, many rural businesses that supplied all those 47,700 dairy farmers that we had in 1978. And now we're heading towards 6,000 dairy farmers. So we've lost a lot of that support system across the general countryside. I think we've strayed further from our farm heritage and our land ethic. That's an inevitable result, I think, of absentee agriculture, of a lot of our land being rented, a lot of the house where the house and the barn is separated off into a farmette, and then the land just becomes a field and it's rented out, and you can show up in the spring and fall, and we're basically in a commodity absentee agriculture. The farm heritage and the land ethic was simply not able to stand up to that. And that's why I say that we've lost a lot of the art of husbandry, because I still think a farm needs a farmer. And that seems like an obvious statement, but it isn't really, because a lot of our farms today don't really have a farmer that's dedicated to that farm piece of land 365 days a year, that that's their home, that they have total responsibility and an allegiance to. You can't uphold that relationship in a landlord-tenant absentee agriculture, commodity-driven agriculture, in my opinion. So what's that has left us with is really looking at, the core of the family farm. How does that survive? How does the culture? Because we spend so much time talking about farming's a business, and it is. Bills have to be paid. Money has to be borrowed. Investments have to be made. There has to be some type of growth just to keep up with the general economy. But at the same time, we want the family farm to be kind of like what we remembered it to be. Obviously, a home and a business. It has to be an essential part of the community. We want the farmer to be a good caretaker of the land and water, a farmer on the farm, each farm with his own farmer. We definitely want that farm to be passed generation to generation. And then we want the farm, I think, a lot of us, to be a sense of place, a homeland in a ever-changing world. So that when we drive through the countryside and we see the red barn and the silo and the house and the lawns mowed and the fences are kept up, we feel good about our food system and our rural economy. I recently had a conversation with a farmer who brought up to me that in his entire farming career, and been farming for a long time, that he had only ever been asked 2 questions from people in his community about his farm. How many acres do you farm and how many cows do you have? And he said he was really getting frustrated with that question. But isn't that really the question that the main concern we've always had, all of us in agriculture? How many acres and how many cows? So I asked him, what would you prefer somebody had asked you? If you could have your druthers, what would those questions be? And he said, I would want to be asked, what have I done to take care of the land and the water on my farm? What have I done to ensure that the farm stays in the family generation to generation? What is my succession plan? And the last question he said, I would like to be asked, what has your farm returned to the greater community? And I thought, wouldn't that be wonderful if those were the 3 questions that we had? So when I wrote Ancestral, which is poems written over 40 years, these are the types of themes that I tried to explore, and obviously in a very different realm. I mean, a lot of us in this society don't spend a lot of time reading poetry. And I'm going to venture this may be one of the only webinar that you listen to this year that somebody's going to break out a book of poetry. But before you run away, give me a shot at this. So when you think about everything that we've been talking about, so this is kind of how I tried to capture this. One of the things that I noticed when I was working with farmers in DATCAP, and I could relate back to my own experience on the farm, was how safe the farm becomes for farmers and their families in an ever-changing world. Just how that they could really value that. And sometimes it seems like the whole world is going by, but if you can just hold on to what you have always known and what your ancestors knew, it makes it all worthwhile. So I'm going to read you a poem that I wrote that refers back to when I was on the farm, and any idea of that someday I would not be farming, or my family farming, or us being on the land would have seemed preposterous. But that is what this poem, and without belaboring the point more, I'll just read you the poem and hopefully you'll get the idea of my message. It's called Cultivating. Day after day, year in and year out, I never left my father's farm. Wore down dirt, a straight path from house to barn. Opened each day with pocket knife and pliers, the ways my father taught me. Out on the blacktop, men raced breakneck speed to jobs in town, to worlds apart from what could be measured, from what could be held close. While I steered the old red tractor, carefully cultivating my narrow rows. 2 hands on the wheel, eyes tucked back beneath my wide brimmed hat, so not to rise up, look ahead, and veer off course into today. It's an image of trying to hold on to what is so important in our heritage that you don't want to look up, take the long view, and veer off course into what may be an unfamiliar or uncertain future. One of the poems in the book that has brought the most comments from other farmers who I've shared the book with. I'm going to share this poem with you now, and it really captures, I think, what a lot of our farmers are feeling right now. So I serve on the DATCAP board of directors, and we just had somebody say at one of our meetings that, and somebody in the dairy processing industry, that he assumed that, or he believed, that we will lose 1/3 of the dairy farms in the state in the next 5 years. And I think he has a good point, because I think he knows what he's talking about. I mean, he's working with those farmers. So just add up the evidence. Take their age, most of them are in their 60s. A lot of them do not have kids returning to the farm. Most of them are on farms that needed